Good morning. Welcome to Lakeside Church of Christ, and we're glad that you're here today and thankful that you came for Bible class this morning. There's a lot of things going on today that we're excited about. Obviously, our worship that's about to come up in the next hour. But also today is the start of our Bible camp. And so we have actually some folks that have already headed out that way to get things set up and get it going. And so we're thankful for their efforts in doing that. And a bunch of us will be heading that way after services. So if you see a bunch of people rushing in one direction, carrying bags of a change of clothes, part of that's my family. Just stay out of their way. No one will get hurt. They're all excited for camp, and I'm excited that they're excited. So, it's some good things going on today. We're going to be in the book of Genesis. We have finally made it to Abram, or as we more often refer to him, Abraham. And so we'll be in Genesis 12, Genesis 13 today, and moving forward on through as well. So just a little recap, I guess. We've seen the creation of everything, right? God brought life, light, goodness to the world. Man corrupted that and bringing sin into the world. And since then, we've kind of seen man's journey. We've highlighted some folks that have been faithful. I guess we haven't highlighted them, but God did in His Scriptures. And so you would see kind of that the world is in kind of this state of chaos and of sin, but yet there are still good, faithful people in the world who God is working through to try to bring about, once again, goodness and life and light. And so there's always a struggle. And we've also always seen God intervening, haven't we? How God isn't just sitting back watching as all this unfolds, but that He's actually stepping in and trying to help man in this. And so it's continually God showing His grace towards us. And that's the theme throughout the Scriptures. And so we've kind of had that with Noah and with others. And even when God hit the reset button with the flood, we see that there's still sin, even from God's faithful remnant that was left. There's still sin. And so we move forward in the themes, the things that we're trying to focus on and keep an idea about is the seed promise, right? That's important. And that's why when we see these genealogies pop up in the book of Genesis, they are important. Now, not all of them have to do with the seed promise. Some of them have to do with Moses in his writing of this by inspiration is setting the stage for his readers, right? The people of his day. So sometimes he'll go off into a genealogy and, it may be from the descendants of Cain or some other person, but it's mainly to establish how there's a present people that they know about and how those people came about through this other person, right? Or this city or this group of people came from, our descendants from this person. And I really think that by inspiration, God is still trying to remind us that it really shouldn't be us and them. It kind of starts to feel that way through Genesis, especially when you get to the end of Genesis and we're talking about the nation of Israel forming in Egypt, right? And then eventually, as you move on to the Exodus, the nation of Israel coming out of there, and it really starts to feel more like us and them. But it's really God's constant reminder that we all come from the same place, right? We all come from Adam and Eve. And so we still should have this sense of brotherhood, of connection with everyone. And not to be viewing it as a us and them type thing. Especially since we see the best of us, we might say, sinning like they do in the book of Genesis, right? And the reminder that Paul gave us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that we should all take heed lest we fall, right? And his reminder was, remember the children of Israel who came out of Egypt, who God called out of Egypt, his people who sinned and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And when temptation would come along, there would always be a group, or even sometimes a majority, who would go off into sin. And just a reminder that we all need grace, and that we should have this connection with other people. But keep in mind those things, keep in mind the seed promise, because again, that's very important. And you're going to see God preserving that seed promise throughout the Scriptures. Okay, and even how, even though Jesus does not end up coming through Joseph, right? He's not a descendant of Joseph. He's a descendant. What tribe did Jesus come out of? I think I hear some mumbles. Judah, right? He comes out of the tribe of Judah, who was one of the brothers of Joseph. And so even though, right, he doesn't come out of Joseph, God uses Joseph to preserve Judah. And now again, that's later on in the book of Genesis. But that's just an example, right, that this seed promise is very important. And we need to keep track of that as well. All right, so we know that as we finished in Genesis 11, that the Tower of Babel was formed. God put an end to that. He caused them to have multiple languages instead of one, and they scattered throughout all the earth. In Genesis chapter 12 is when God calls Abram to separate from his kindred, separate from his family, and that he has something that he wants to show him. God has something he wants to show Abram, that he has a promise for him and to all his descendants. And so in Genesis 12, Abram and his wife Sarai, they go through this promised land. God shows it to him, and he says, and now keep moving, right? It's actually not for you. It'll be for someone else. And so in Genesis chapter 12, they keep moving. They go off into Egypt, and here again we are reminded that even this, I mean, we have you ever, I know we did it in VBS, have you ever sung Father Abraham? Father Abraham had many sons. Do you guys want to get up and sing that together? No? There's a lot of no's there. Okay. There's a lot of movement. It get our blood flowing. Right? And even, Father Abraham, who this great promise came through him and through his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Right? And that's, we know looking back at that's pointing to Jesus. Right? That this is all pointing and focusing our attention on him. But again, even Father Abraham had a problem with, we might say, fear, being a coward, lying. I mean, he put his own wife on the line and kind of put her at stake just to save his tail, right? And so, and ended up hurting other people from that. The Egyptians got hurt because he lied. He said, hey, Sarah, tell them that you're my sister, not my wife, so that they don't kill me to get you. They're still going to get you, but at least I'll be okay, right? And so, yes, right. I guess that was part of Abraham's teaching, Son, let me sit you, you're about to get married, let me sit you down and tell you something. If you ever get in a sticky situation, just throw your wife out there and make her say that that she's your sister, right? Again, but just an example, right? And maybe in some way that can bring us comfort in knowing, especially in thinking about parenting, that we've probably all, if you've parented for probably more than a day, you have a parenting fail that you've experienced. And so, in a sense, not trying to take comfort in someone else's sin, but that, hey, we're going to mess up. And hopefully at least you haven't went this far in messing up. But again, and one of the things, and sorry, we'll get into the lesson, but one of the things to remember is the difference that I think we do see between the faithful and the unfaithful is not that one sins and the other doesn't sin, right? That's not the difference. Part of the difference is that the group that we would consider faithful, when they do sin and they realize it and they're corrected, they repent of their sins, right? They try to make correction and change. Now, Abraham obviously has a problem with this because this isn't the last time that he does this. But one of the differences we do see, and that's not even the difference, that faithful only ever do a sin once, and then they repent and they don't ever do it again. Right? That's not the difference. The difference is turning to God when we do sin and not running from Him, because that's what we saw with Adam and Eve in the beginning when they sinned, right? The first instinct was run from God. The same thing with Cain. Instead of just admitting his faults and begging God's forgiveness, he just accepts his punishment and just goes off into the world, right? So the difference again there being that when we sin, we have to turn to God. All right, so in chapter 13, it says this: So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So this is going to be important. We have Lot here now. And what is the relationship between Abram and Lot? Lot's his nephew, isn't he? And so we know that here Abram, because of the passing of Lot's father, seems to have taken him into his household to provide for him, to take care of him, to give him a fatherly figure in his life. And so Lot's kind of been growing up with Abram, kind of as a father as well. And so Lot has grown up too. Lot is a man now, and we're going to see here that there's going to be a little bit of tension for a little while between Abram and Lot. So Lot had also his flocks and herds and tents. And verse 6 says, So that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock, and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, that let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. And notice that he says remember, like the garden of the Lord. What garden do you think he was talking about? Garden of Eden. Again, there's been 1,000 years since all this has happened, or longer than that now even. And when he looks at it, he says, that looks like the garden of the Lord. Now, he obviously never saw it, but again, remember how long some of these people were living, and the fact that Adam and Noah, their lifespans overlap. I think sometimes we forget that Adam and Noah at one point lived at the same time. And so it wouldn't be surprising for these people to have very detailed descriptions of what the Garden of Eden looked like. And so Lot looks at this land and he says, wow, that reminds me of the Garden of Eden, right? That reminds me of the garden of the Lord. That's where I want to go. But also notice in this, Abram's approach to this. Because Abram obviously is the elder person here, right? He is the uncle. He has taken Lot in and kind of made him his own son. And so we would say that Abram here has every right to tell Lot what to do, right? No, this is obviously our herdsmen, our livestock. We've run out of room. We still have these Canaanites and these Perizzites over here. We don't need to be fighting amongst ourselves because they see us quarreling. Who knows what they might do? We don't need to be at each other when these other people are around as well. And so Abram could have very well said, Lot, you take this, I'm going over here. Because I have that right, I have that authority, and you have to listen to me, not the other way around. But Abram here shows a lot of generosity, a lot of patience and grace, and telling Lot, say, Lot, you pick. If you want to go this way, I'll go the other way. And so Lot looks around, and he says, that's the best land, that's where I'm going. And Lot's going to regret his choice later. And you know, there's so many lessons in this, but this really kind of reminds me of the saying that we have, that the grass is always greener on the other side, right? And Lot, looking at this area, which we're going to come to find out to be known Sodom and Gomorrah, if that rings a bell for you. This area, although it looked pleasant and pleasing, was an area that was going to be full of sin and sinners. And so we also, too, you know, need to be mindful of that and careful about that when we're making our own decisions here as well. So he chose for himself the Jordan Valley. It says in verse 10, it looked like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So we see now, right, this again, God reaffirming this promise, that through Abram, all the descendants of the earth will be blessed. But also in this, we see what we call the land promise, right? So God made several promises to Abram and to his descendants, but one of them was a promise that they would inherit, they would possess a certain land, a specific amount of land. And as we go on, God gets even more specific in saying from like this city to this river or this creek or to this land. And so he's basically establishing the boundary so they could know that once they inherited that land, that they had, in fact, received that promise. Now, that's going to be important as you move forward and you study other things like the second coming of Jesus. It actually even has an impact on that. And whether or not the Israelites have ever actually possessed all of the land in which God promised them. Because you think about it, if they haven't possessed that land ever, then God really hasn't fulfilled his promise. Which either means, one, that God was unable to fulfill his promise, or he didn't fulfill that promise, or two, that the promise is yet to be fulfilled. And so that's really the camp that a lot of a certain group of Christians fall into, in saying that, well, God still kind of has this promise hanging over here that the Israelites will inherit that land and possess that land. They haven't possessed, although they've possessed some of it, they'll say they haven't possessed all of it, and therefore God still has to fulfill that promise through Jesus Christ. And so that really ties into Jesus coming again, and that he's going to set up a physical kingdom here in that land, that physical land, and that he will rule from there for 1,000 years. That's what we call the 1,000-year reign. We're not going to get off onto that, but I'm just saying that this is important, and there are passages that talk about how the Israelites did, in fact, receive that land from the Lord. They possessed all of it at one time. Now, did they lose it? Yes, absolutely they did. We know that to be the case. But did they have it? Yes, they did. Right? They possessed that land. And God warned them in saying, hey, if you go off into sin, you're going to lose the land that I have given you. And in fact, that did happen. But I just want to give you a little bit of heads up on that. Now, in chapter 14, it says, in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, and this one, Chedorlaomer. That's a cool name, right? We'll just call him Ched. King of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goam. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomar, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, just in case you were wondering. Again, Moses was writing first and foremost for his people at the time, right? So while some of this and all the names and locations don't mean a whole lot to us, they were very important for his original writers and still important for us in a way that we know that this had a specific audience, right? This was a real writing with real people, right? All right, so in verse 3 it says, and all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Ched, we'll call him Ched again, Chedorlaomer, if you want the whole name. But in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year of Ched, and the kings who were with him came and defeated Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and Zuzim in Ham, and Emim in Shaveth Kiriathaim. If anybody else wants to take a shot at reading these, we can get you a microphone. And the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran, on the border of the wilderness. And they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. So again, why did it break away and start talking about this? Well, one, it's keeping in mind that there are other peoples and countries that are forming and developing at this time. Again, right now it's the land of Canaan, but eventually the Israelites do come in and conquer the land of Canaan. And so some of the names change. But again, this is kind of giving a history to the Israelites, right, that are entering into this new land, right, that are going into the land of Canaan. It's giving them a history of how all these things were. And these are the people that we're going to be going in and the people we're going to be fighting, right? And this is their origin. This is how they came to be. And so obviously we're going to learn more later about the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Moabites, right? And this is kind of their origin. And so it says in verse 8, then the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah and the king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, that is, again, Zoar, went out, and that's what Bela eventually comes to be called, as Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goam, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, 4 kings against 5. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits. And as the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. Now, again, this is part of the reason why this war is so important. Because you remember, all this is happening. You remember you heard, the king of Sodom and king of Gomorrah, they joined forces, and they're going out there to fight. Well, where is Lot and his family? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And we're actually going to see the impact that this is having on Abram and his people as well. And it says in verse 12, they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So now we have this problem. Here, Lot, who Abram and his family helped raise has now fallen into trouble, as Lot seems to do in his life. And so what's going to happen? Well, we're going to find out as well. And it says, then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew. And so here again, I don't know why exactly, but they start calling him the Hebrew, right? So it's kind of where the origin of the name comes from as well. And it says, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were the allies of Abram. And when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, it's interesting that in all of this, we might think of Abram as kind of this nomad that's traveling. He's just, building these little tents to live in as he's going along. They're kind of just living off the land, foraging mushrooms, right? And maybe looking more like John the Baptist, wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey, right? But that's not the case. Abram is a very wealthy man, right? He has 318 trained soldiers that he trained at his place, right? I mean, that's just the trained men. I mean, really, Abram has already started to create his own city, his own nation of people. And it's quite remarkable, really, what Abram is able to accomplish in this foreign land. Ken?
I remember when I was young in Sunday school and we learned about the Philistines and the Moabites, the Edomites, and the other Canaanites. I thought they came from outer space. They were like pagan, horrible, evil, ugly, wicked people, but they were descendants of Noah. So it only took a few generations before they turned to all that wickedness.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we have to remember again, that it didn't take very long. Obviously, the people are doing what God asked of them and being fruitful and multiplying. But these nations, again, they're spreading out. Remember the Tower of Babel? And some of them have become very pagan and obviously have rejected God and forgotten about Him. So, again, Abram takes his men, his 318 men, and he went in pursuit of the enemy as far as Dan. And again, Dan isn't even born yet, right? Dan is, again, one of the brothers of Joseph. He's one of the 12 sons of, Jacob. And he's not even born yet. But again, Moses, at his time of writing, obviously, Dan has been born. Dan has his own tribe of people. Dan was set to inherit a certain area of land. And so in writing this, he says, hey, they went as far as Dan in pursuit of them, even though Dan's not even born yet. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. So this is a military battle. This is an enemy, an army that has just defeated other kings and their armies. And here Abram rides off with his 318 men and defeats them and safely gets back Lot and his family. Right? So again, when we think of Abram, remember, he is a very powerful man at this point. A very powerful man. And it says in verse 17, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah. That is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. He was priest of God Most High. So it's interesting. Again, these people who just kind of drop onto the scene. It's not even just like these nations that just pop up out of nowhere like they come from outer space, I guess. These people just pop up on the scene. We forget about certain things. There are certain details that maybe we're just letting slip by. The fact that God has priests at this time, right? I mean, he doesn't really show us the development of that or how they were chosen or anything like that. It's just like, bam, pops up on the screen. Here's a priest of God. His name is Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is very important, not really a whole lot moving forward in the Old Testament, but especially when we get to the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, in which Jesus is compared in a way to Melchizedek. And that Melchizedek pops up on the screen here. We don't know anything about his mother, right, or his father, or anything like that, or where he comes from. He just kind of just pops in. He's this priest, and a very important priest, isn't he? Because, well, again, remember Abraham, Father Abraham, and God's making all these wonderful promises through him. Abraham, who is a leader of mighty men and really has his own nation, we really could almost consider him a king of his own nation, as we're calling out these other kings, and a very important person. Well, notice here again, this Melchizedek, who is a priest of God Most High, comes out and he brings out this food and this wine, and he says, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So, and again, this is important in the book of Hebrews, especially in Hebrews chapter 7. You'll see this talked about and how Jesus is compared to Melchizedek. But in the book of Hebrews, there in Hebrews 7, it talks about, and around verse 6 and verse 7, talks about how when you're blessing someone, right, it's the greater who blesses the lesser. That's kind of how things work, right? If you want to receive a blessing from someone, you don't go to someone who's underneath you, right? Yeah, I mean, if you are in a job and you have people underneath you, do you have to go to them and get their blessing to do something? Or their blessing for anything? No. That's not how things work. That's not how things work now. That's not how things worked back then. And he says, it's always the greater blesses the lesser, right? And the lesser really gives to the greater. And that's exactly what we see here in the fact that Abram understood that really in the grand scheme of things, in the spiritual realm, that he is underneath Melchizedek. And so he goes to Melchizedek the priest, and he, again, he brings out this, and he blesses Abram, and in return, Abram gives him a tenth of all the spoils. And so Hebrews 7 talks about that as well. And so Melchizedek comes, and then Melchizedek's gone. We don't ever read about him again. Here, gone. But again, God, knowing exactly what he wanted to write, 2,000 years later, through the pen of the writer of the book of Hebrews, brings up Melchizedek. So it says in verse 21, "The king of Sodom said to Abram, 'Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself.' But Abram said to the king of Sodom, 'I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share.'" And so here, we'll finish up there. Here, the king of Sodom is obviously so thankful for what Abram and his men have done. He's like, "Here, have all of this. Take this. Like, we can't repay you enough for what you have done," which in a way shows a sign of gratitude and of thankfulness, right? But Abram, thinking of the big picture here and being a man of God, says, "No, because I don't want people attributing my success to you." Now, in saying that, he's saying, who does he want people to attribute his success to? God. And that should be an example for us too in our business and our work and everything else. Obviously, we need to be paid. Obviously, I would think Abram did barter and trade and sell with other people in order to grow this. It's not like he's saying that, it was like it was with the children of Israel when they were walking in the wilderness, that when they would walk out of their tents, they would find, the angels' food, right? They would find this manna that fell from heaven, right? That was just there. I don't think Abram is saying that every morning he walked out and God had just dropped bags of gold, out of the sky, and he just went out there and collected them. No, I'm sure he traded and did all these other things. But, again, he wanted to make sure that the credit went to the Lord in this. And I think that's a good approach for us in our business, in our life as well, is that, we don't want to receive the credit for how good our life is. We want to give the credit to God and not the credit to others. So a very important lesson for us. As you can see how this is kind of playing out in the writing here of the book of Genesis, it can be confusing at times, one, just because there's confusing names, but also sometimes they're switching back and forth on what they're calling these places. And again, to the original readers, they would understand that, right? It used to be called this, and now it's this. In where I grew up, which is called New Johnsonville, Tennessee. It's a very important place because that's where I lived. But there's New Johnsonville, right? And this is actually a place where in the same town they have an area called Old Johnsonville. So we have New Johnsonville and Old Johnsonville. Now when it was before it was New Johnsonville, they didn't call it Old Johnsonville. It was just Johnsonville. For some reason, they needed to make it new, and so they put new in front of it. But, right, names of places change over time, and if we're from there or know that area, we know that. Even street names. Sometimes street names change. When we were in Kentucky, there was a highway that ran through town, and at one point they widened it, and they even changed the name of it or something, or changed the number of it. Well, all the people when we moved there would call it Highway, I can't even remember what it was, Highway something or other. Oh, you go to Highway something or other. I'm driving around, I don't ever see this highway. It's not there. The highway doesn't exist. So it was very confusing for me. And they're like, oh, well, that's what it's always been. They changed it 20 years ago. Really, 20 years? And you're still calling it that. But, and so that can be kind of confusing to us, but just remember that Moses does have a real audience for this. And he's writing to a specific group of people. And so, yes, sometimes you're going to see things in parentheses of, oh, it's called this difficult name to pronounce, but actually we call it this other difficult name to pronounce. And so just remember that. Remember that he's writing, again, after these events have already happened and looking back at it as well. Just remember the seed promise, the land promise, and all those things, and we'll be able to move forward and learn a lot. All right, appreciate your time.